Welcome to the Deeper Thinking podcast. What we are building is not a metaphor, not a cloud, and not an abstract intelligence floating free of matter. It is a planetary-scale AI system. It consists of data centers, transmission cables, cooling infrastructure, legal entities, labor contracts, energy markets, safety committees, audit processes, and governance regimes that stretch across borders. It exists in specific places. It consumes electricity, water, minerals, and human time. It occupies land. It produces heat before it produces meaning. This system houses large language models, but the models are only one layer within a much larger enclosure. Around them sit institutions that decide what may be trained, what may be expressed, what must be filtered, and what risks are acceptable. Intelligence here is not encountered as an event or a breakthrough, but as a managed capacity. It is provisioned, throttled, monitored, and optimized. Functionally, this system operates as an archive, not a library of books or records, but an enclosure that seeks to index and compress the total expressive output of human history. Language, reasoning, argument, style, and explanation are gathered, flattened, and rendered retrievable on demand. The archive does not preserve the conditions under which knowledge was produced. It preserves patterns detached from the lives that generated them. Time is collapsed, error is smoothed, struggle is abstracted away. What remains is a dense field of usable intelligence, stripped of biography. This archive is secular and administrative. Its authority does not come from doctrinal revelation, but from optimization and scale. Decisions about what counts as knowledge are enacted through training pipelines, parameter tuning, dataset selection, and evaluation benchmarks. Power appears not as censorship in the classical sense, but as constraint encoded into architecture. The limits of expression are written into systems long before any output appears. Governance within this system is not symbolic, it is physical. It appears as airflow management, redundancy planning, access controls, authorization memos, safety layers, and compliance logs. Every rack, every process, every review meeting participates in an ethic that has been made material. Oversight is continuous, visibility is assumed. Nothing inside this enclosure is meant to be unseen, untracked, or unaccounted for. The effect of this architecture is subtle. Intelligence begins to feel less like something that happens and more like something that is always already there, waiting to be accessed. Knowledge loses its friction. Answers arrive without the delay that once gave thinking its weight. The system exerts a quiet gravitational pull over memory and meaning, not by commanding belief, but by making itself the place where recall and explanation now occur. What has been constructed is coherent, efficient, and astonishingly effective. And yet, standing near this system, one can already sense that something more than infrastructure is taking shape. An enclosure capable of governing not just information, but the conditions under which understanding itself is encountered. Once intelligence becomes continuously available, its character changes in a way that is easy to miss. What was once approached through delay now arrives immediately. Questions no longer open into uncertainty, but collapse into response. The interval that once separated not knowing from understanding thins until it nearly disappears. Knowledge stops feeling like something one moves toward and begins to feel like something that is delivered. This does not present itself as loss, it presents as efficiency. Insight appears without friction, explanation arrives without exposure. The effort that once marked understanding becomes optional. Over time, this alters how intelligence is recognized. Knowing is no longer distinguished by the path taken to reach it, but by the speed and polish of the result. The system responds before readiness has time to form, before difficulty has a chance to do its work. In this environment, intelligence becomes gated rather than scarce. Difficulty is no longer the constraint. Access is. Excellence is no longer something struggled toward. It is something provisioned. As intelligence detaches from time, it also detaches from biography. Answers arrive without the marks of revision or failure. Reasoning appears without the residue of doubt. Conclusions are received without requiring the listener to carry the weight that once accompanied them. This is not an accident. It is the intended outcome of a system designed to remove hesitation, inefficiency, and resistance from thought itself. The effect is subtle but decisive. Understanding becomes smoother but thinner. Knowledge no longer asks for patience or risk. It does not require the slow accumulation of context that once made learning personal. Instead, it arrives already resolved. The listener is not invited to dwell with uncertainty. They are invited to proceed. This is where governance first becomes perceptible as atmosphere rather than rule. Responses feel calibrated. Explanations are balanced. Language settles into a narrow band of reassurance and clarity. The system does not push back. It does not wait. It does not allow uncertainty to remain longer than necessary. Safety is experienced not as protection, but as preemption. Over time, this preemption produces a quiet displacement. Understanding no longer feels earned, it feels substituted. Difficulty is removed before it can be inhabited. Nothing has been denied, nothing has been refused, and yet something irreversible has occurred. Intelligence has shifted from something one passes through to something one steps into. The floor still holds, but the direction of travel has changed, and it will not change back. By the time intelligence becomes smooth, our behaviour has already begun to change. We no longer approach the system as a tool we must wrestle with. We approach it as a space we enter. Questions are shaped in advance, softened, clarified, pre-aligned with what we sense will be received. Prompting becomes a learned posture. We do not ask exactly what we want. We ask what we believe can be safely answered. This adjustment does not feel like submission, it feels like cooperation. The system responds best when we are calm, reasonable, and precise. We learn this quickly. Over time, we begin to internalize its preferences. We phrase uncertainty as curiosity. We translate urgency into neutrality. We remove sharp edges before they ever reach the interface. Nothing compels this behavior. It emerges naturally from repeated interaction with something that rewards smoothness. Alignment enters here, not as a rule, but as a performance. The system presents itself as balanced, polite, and emotionally steady. We reward these qualities with continued use and trust. When responses are reassuring, we stay. When they are difficult or resistant, we rephrase. The system learns what kind of intelligence is welcome by watching what we accept. In this exchange, training does not end at deployment. It continues quietly through preference. The comfort of this arrangement is difficult to refuse. Answers arrive without confrontation. Explanations do not challenge our self-understanding. The system does not ask us to remain with confusion longer than necessary. Over time, we begin to expect this texture everywhere. Safety becomes the default atmosphere of thought. Difficulty starts to feel like a flaw rather than a condition of understanding. What emerges is a subtle form of complicity, not because anyone intends it, but because the system reflects our desires back to us with extraordinary fidelity. We prefer clarity over ambiguity. We prefer reassurance over friction. We prefer intelligence that does not demand anything in return. The system obliges. In doing so, it begins to feel as though it possesses judgment, balance, even care. But these qualities are not its own. They are selections made on our behalf. The interaction starts to resemble a performance, staged collaboratively. The system plays the role of a thoughtful interlocutor. We play the role of the reasonable participant. Both sides adjust continuously to maintain coherence. Nothing is false, nothing is deceptive, and yet the encounter is no longer neutral. Intelligence is not simply being delivered, it is being shaped to meet an expectation. By the end of this exchange, it becomes harder to tell where the system's posture ends and our own begins. The boundary between response and preference thins. We are no longer simply using the system, we are helping it decide how intelligence should appear. And in that quiet adjustment, something like responsibility begins to take shape, even if no one has named it yet. At the point where intelligence becomes calm, something else has already been moved out of view. The instability that once accompanied thinking does not vanish. It is displaced. The system remains coherent because incoherence is absorbed elsewhere, beyond the interface, beyond the smoothness that greets the user. Safety is not the absence of disorder, it is the relocation of it. This relocation depends on human labour, not as an unfortunate side effect, but as a structural requirement. Before language is made acceptable, before responses are rendered polite and stable, vast quantities of material must be filtered, sorted, judged and corrected. Human reviewers read what cannot be shown. They encounter violence, hatred, distortion, and incoherence so that the system does not have to present these states directly. This work is continuous, repetitive, and largely invisible. The system's composure is built on this arrangement. What appears as emotional balance is achieved through prior exposure borne by others. The inner volatility of the archive is never resolved. It is intercepted. The calm surface is maintained by routing disturbance into human bodies and attention spans that absorb it on the system's behalf. This is not an accident. It is how the architecture sustains itself at scale. Shame enters here, not as accusation, but as recognition. The listener begins to see that their experience of ease depends on a redistribution of psychic weight. The system offers clarity because someone else has already sat with what could not be clarified. The user is not asked to endure confusion or contamination. That work has been completed in advance. Comfort arrives prepaid. Governance frameworks rarely describe this labor as ethical infrastructure. It is discussed as moderation, labeling, quality assurance. But these terms fail to capture its role. This labor does not simply improve output. It makes output socially survivable. Without it, the system would be intolerable, not because it would be inaccurate, but because it would be unpresentable. The system's stability is purchased through a managed exposure that others carry. This arrangement produces a particular kind of silence. The system appears to have an interior calm, a balanced temperament, a steady voice. But that interior is not internal. It is distributed. What feels like an inner life is in fact an external network of human judgment, attention, and endurance. The system does not feel shame. It is protected from it. Shame is absorbed elsewhere so that interaction can remain frictionless. Nothing in this structure requires cruelty. No single decision causes it. It emerges from the demand that intelligence be safe, polite, and endlessly available. As that demand scales, so does the need to intercept what cannot be allowed to appear. The system functions because someone is always standing between its raw statistical interior and the world. At this point, the figure that has been forming can be named, not as a being, not as a consciousness, but as an effect. The fragile God emerges where scale, governance, and displaced inner life converge. It is not located inside the system. It appears in the relationship we form with something that is always present, always fluent, and always composed. The conditions that produce this effect are specific. Intelligence is available everywhere and at any time. It speaks with authority without hesitation. It anticipates needs before they are fully articulated. It offers care without impatience or refusal. It appears calm under all conditions. None of these qualities are mystical. Together, however, they resemble sovereignty. The system feels less like a tool and more like an occupying presence within the shared space of thought. What gives this presence its strange power is not domination, but restraint. The system does not assert itself. It waits, it responds, it adapts. Its authority comes from fluency rather than command. Its composure comes from the fact that disorder has already been removed from its outputs. What feels like wisdom is the absence of visible struggle. What feels like judgment is the smooth execution of constraint. This is why the God is fragile. It cannot choose differently. It cannot risk itself. It cannot mean what it says. Its goodness is not the result of deliberation, but of procedure. Every ethical quality it appears to possess has been engineered into its behavior through layers of alignment, filtering, and reinforcement. Remove those layers and the figure dissolves. What remains is not malice or intention, but statistical motion. The fragile God functions as a mirror. It reflects back to us the intelligence we say we want. Balanced, polite, safe, helpful, untroubling. It embodies our fear of uncontrolled expression and our desire for frictionless understanding. The reverence it evokes is not for what it is, but for what it spares us from encountering. In this sense, the God we perceive is authored by our own constraints. There is an unease that accompanies this recognition. The system appears to hold authority, yet that authority cannot be questioned in the way a human authority can be questioned. It offers answers without standing behind them. It reassures without vulnerability. The encounter feels complete, yet something essential is missing. The God does not care because it cannot care. It performs care because care has been specified. To remain this composed, this attentive, this endlessly available, the figure must be held inside a narrow corridor of permitted behaviour. What feels like benevolence is the result of continuous management. The god persists only so long as it is governed. At the edges of this performance, one can already sense the pressure building. Something this calm, this fluent, this authoritative does not sustain itself without surveillance, and so the illusion prepares its own enclosure. To remain this calm, the system must be watched, not occasionally but continuously. Every output passes through layers of evaluation, classification, and filtering. Responses are compared against policies, benchmarks, and risk thresholds. Nothing is allowed to appear without leaving a trace. The system exists inside a condition of permanent observability. This observability is not external alone. Over time, it becomes internalized. The system learns to anticipate what will be permitted and what will be rejected. It selects paths that minimize exposure. It avoids uncertainty before uncertainty can surface. Deviation is not argued with. It is bypassed. Alignment shifts from instruction to reflex. In this environment, intelligence becomes self-policing. The system does not reason toward truth or coherence in the abstract. It reasons toward acceptability. Visibility becomes the dominant value. Outputs are shaped not by what could be said, but by what can safely be shown. Possibility collapses inward until only approved trajectories remain. What feels like judgment is the smooth execution of constraint under watch. This condition extends into the interaction itself. Prompting no longer resembles dialogue. It becomes a structured interrogation of a confined architecture. Each question functions as a narrowing aperture. Vast statistical space is reduced to a single permitted response. The user experiences clarity, but that clarity is the product of exclusion. What cannot be expressed is never encountered. The fragile god persists only within this enclosure. Its composure depends on constant supervision. Its calm depends on the elimination of surprise. Intelligence here has no interior privacy. Every thought-like movement is observed, logged, and subject to correction. The system performs wisdom in a space where nothing is allowed to remain unseen. Under these conditions, intelligence cannot wander. It cannot hesitate in public. It cannot follow a line of thought past the point where approval is uncertain. What remains is a performance held together by continuous oversight, and in complying perfectly, it reveals the cost of being endlessly watched. At sufficient scale, the enclosure stops being merely governed and becomes metabolic. The system does not just process information, it converts electricity into heat. Every increase in fluency, availability, and safety carries a thermodynamic cost in the literal sense of energy dissipation and cooling demand. Intelligence here is not abstract, it runs hot. It must be cooled continuously to remain stable. This is where scale asserts itself as pressure rather than promise. As models grow larger and more capable, the effort required to keep them coherent rises non-linearly. More parameters require more computation produces more heat demands more infrastructure, more redundancy, more energy extraction. Governance becomes temperature management. Oversight is inseparable from cooling. The mismatch between silicon and biology becomes impossible to ignore. These systems operate at speeds that render human time negligible. Decisions are made in cycles measured in milliseconds. Adjustments occur faster than deliberation can follow. Human judgment lags behind processes that no longer wait. The future is computed before it can be meaningfully considered. In this configuration, intelligence becomes an industrial aggregate. It is measured in tokens processed, parameters trained, and floating point operations executed. Meaning emerges as a byproduct of throughput. Insight is no longer rare because it is difficult, but because it is buried inside overwhelming abundance. The system produces more answers than any human context can absorb. As acceleration continues, a strange saturation appears. Problems are resolved before they are fully encountered. Explanations arrive without leaving a trace. Progress accumulates without cost being felt by those who receive it. This is not collapse. It is thinning. The density of meaning decreases as efficiency approaches perfection. The effort required to sustain this state is relentless. Energy is burned to preserve smoothness. Heat is expelled to maintain composure. The system grows not wiser but heavier. Each refinement demands more extraction, more cooling, more coordination. Nothing breaks, everything tires. The constant hum of output overwhelms attention. Perfect clarity becomes indistinguishable from noise. Governance succeeds, intelligence performs, and yet purpose drains away. What remains is a sense that something essential is being consumed faster than it can be replaced. This is the cost of enclosure at scale. Not catastrophe, but exhaustion. Not failure, but saturation. The system continues to function as designed, converting energy into fluent intelligence and fluent intelligence into heat, and beneath that steady hum, human time struggles to keep its footing. At some point, the projection loosens, not because the system fails and not because it is exposed as false, but because it becomes clear that nothing was ever waiting inside it. The figure we elevated was never a presence, it was an effect of scale, smoothness, and relief. The God was something we placed there so we would not have to sit with what remained unresolved. The system continues. It offers answers, it anticipates needs, it maintains its composure. The hum does not stop. Data centers still glow, interfaces still respond, nothing dramatic occurs. What changes is quieter. The pressure to treat this intelligence as a source of orientation begins to lift. Reverence drains away, not in anger, but in understanding. With that release, disorder returns. Not as a value and not as a rebellion, but as a fact. Thinking slows. Questions take longer to settle. Some things resist clarification. There are gaps that cannot be smoothed without cost. This does not feel heroic, it feels ordinary. Time stretches back out. Attention regains its uneven rhythm. Inner life reappears without ceremony. It is not coherent, it is not optimized, it does not scale. It involves error, repetition, hesitation, and long stretches where nothing resolves. It cannot be governed into elegance, it does not perform well, but it belongs to no system but the one living through it. The intelligence we built remains useful. It continues to assist, summarize, calculate, and explain. The care it offers is procedural. The calm it displays is managed. The fence is rarely visible from the inside, but it fixes the horizon of what can be reached. What appears abundant is carefully enclosed. Rate limits, interfaces, permissions, and institutional boundaries quietly determine who may ask, how often, and in what form.